Henson, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Okay, so my topic this evening is the economy of tomorrow, and in particular, the three main ways I expect the economy to change over the long run and into the future. There are certainly more than three ways that it will, but given my 10 minutes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the main ways I think it's going to change. So my talk is about the long run. And when economists talk about the long run, we're actually talking about something pretty specific. It's not just sometime way out there. But we don't define it in years. Instead, we say that the long run is the time when there are no fixed factors of production. And what that means, to translate out of economics, is that if you're running a business, you can pretty much change entirely how you make it. Also, you can open or close a business, or you can enter or exit a market. And in the long run, prices change, expectations adapt. So that's what we're talking about. And when I say long run throughout this talk, I don't want you to think of a year as much as this is a scope for transformation. So why are we talking about the long run tonight? Well, the reason is that the long run is what will matter to us. We Exonians, we're the long run in economics. By the time we're economically relevant, when we're working, spending incomes, building new firms, expanding old ones, or discovering new markets, the amount of long-run economic change will dwarf any short-run volatility. In fact, just to put things in perspective, the peak earning year for the average student at PA today, and upper or lower, one of you in the audience, is likely to be 2045. That's a long way off, and I would say, indeed, will fall into that long run. So this is about the economy of 2045, and there are three important overarching questions I want to ask tonight. They are, first, what will the economy of 2045, the economy of the future, look like? Second, what can we know now about what it will look like? And third, I have a question that I want you to think about. What can we do about it? That is, how do we as individuals prepare for such economic change? Or alternatively, is government action the right way to go? Let's start with the second question, a question which asks us to consider our uncertainty and the limits to our knowledge. What can we know about the economy of the future? The original Star Trek series, filmed in the late 1960s, gives us a sense of both the limits and the power of looking into the future 30 years out. As its fans know, humans are not flying in the Starship Enterprise today, as was foreseen at the time. And yet, a surprising amount of the technology that you see in that control room is now, that seemed impossibly futuristic when that show was filmed, are now among our standard products today, or closely resemble them. I'm thinking of cell phones, laptop and tablet computers, the internet. That's just to get us started. The economist Scott Sumner wrote something recently about how to have your predictions end up like the cell phone, and not the Starship Enterprise. He said, pay attention to pundits who make patently obvious predictions. Ignore those who make brilliant predictions. Therefore, I'm going to make three patently obvious predictions tonight, working off long-run trends, all three of which should require, in my opinion, unimaginable economic change to halt or reverse. So number one, almost all economic interactions will occur across borders and not within them. Number two, socioeconomic inequality will worsen internationally but improve globally. Number three, the productivity revolution in goods industries will spread to services. We'll discuss each of them in that order, and I just want to say one quick thing, which is that each of them could be their own presentations spanning hours, but I'm hoping that with such a survey, I can spark your interest in economics to just sort of do a little more research on your own. So let's start with the first contention, that the economy of the future is largely going to be about trade, the amount of economic activity that occurs solely within our own borders, within our own domestic markets, will pale in comparison to what is globally exchanged in the long run. So this is a graph of the trade to GDP ratio. And I want you to look at how it has changed over the past century of American history. And the trade to GDP ratio combines our imports and our exports and considers that as a fraction of everything we produce, goods and services in this country in a year. So there are a few things that you should notice about this graph. The first is that change to the trade to GDP ratio happens over the long run. It's not very volatile. The second thing is that it's increasing, and that change is accelerating towards ever more trade. Finally, notice that it takes a lot to throw the trade to GDP ratio off. This drop you see in the late 40s in the mid 40s is World War II. So both the United States and the world are ever more focused on trade. In fact, as compared to previous recoveries, it's been growth in our exports, which has helped us most in coming out of the last recession. Another stunning data point, global trade volumes, the amount of actual stuff that gets shipped around the world, has tripled in the last 20 years. So what's driving this trend? Some of it is economic integration, such as the establishment of free trade zones like NAFTA and the European Union's common economy. As such barriers to trade have come down, the economies of the developing world have been expanding, and the cost of trade and transport have also fallen. The combination of these three changes is causing a massive and continued expansion in the role that trade plays in the American and global economy. The second thing I see coming is a more unequal America amid a more equal world. First, income inequality is on the rise in the United States. In front of you is a graph of a measure of inequality called the Gini ratio, one which social science uses frequently. How we calculate it is a little bit complicated, but what it measures is how unevenly distributed income is between families within a society. And what we see in this graph is that since the 1970s, inequality has been rising in the United States. But why do we see rising inequality in America? One of the most significant drivers of this inequality is education. Education has become more valuable, more determinative of your economic success or failure in life than it ever used to be. Consider this. Since 1973, the average hourly wage of high school dropouts has fallen 20% in real terms, while over the same time period, it has risen 20% on average for those with a college degree. The rise of income inequality is in large part a product of inequality in education, and there's no indication that this trend will stop. If anything, education-related inequality will increase as our economy becomes more dependent on skilled labor. However, education is not the full story. There has been a dramatic increase in the share of income which goes to the top 1%. We know this. In fact, looking at just the top 1% is really too broad. Most of the gains within that top 1% have gone to the top half of 1%, to the top 10th of that top 1%, and even to the top 100th of that 1%. Now, these few people at the tip top are not significantly more educated than, say, those 1 or 2% down. We're really talking about now a few thousand individuals who have benefited disproportionately from the way that the modern economy works, and in my opinion, appear well positioned to continue to do so. So while there's been more inequality in the United States at any time since the Gilded Age, we see the reverse process happening around the globe. And this is something that I don't think gets as much attention as it really should be. This is a really remarkable change. The poorest nations of the world are becoming less poor and converging with middle income and richer countries. We see this in the graph of the Gini coefficient, that measure of inequality that we talked about only a few minutes ago, for family incomes all around the world. Of course, the global distribution of income is greatly unequal. Look at how high the Gini coefficient is here. But this is changing pretty quickly. What's going on here in particular is the massive uplifting out of poverty for millions upon millions of people, in particular in East Asia, over the last few decades. My third and final point this evening is that the productivity revolution which has occurred in goods industries, we'll talk about what that is in a moment, but think of it as a massive increase in the efficiency with which we make physical goods. That's going to unfold in the services industry in the long run. So, the productivity revolution in goods industries is staring us in the face, really. On the top left is a picture of the Ford Model T assembly line in Dearborn, Michigan in 1914. At the time, this technology, this assembly process, was state-of-the-art. On the bottom right is what counts as state-of-the-art in auto manufacturing today. Now, I've actually looked at this picture pretty closely, made it pretty wide on my computer screen. I can't find a single person in the photo. That's the extent to which that we've become productive in goods industries, and in particular in manufacturing. Now, I want you to compare these productivity gains to those in the service industries. Education. The top picture is very much like the bottom picture, although they're separated by 10 decades. Now, I'm not saying we replace teachers with robotic arms, but this isn't unusual for service industries either. If you look at healthcare or medical services or leisure services, you do not see the same sort of productivity gains that we've seen in goods industry. There we go. Okay. So we actually see this in the data. Economists look at productivity as output per man hour, and since 1990, productivity in services industries has grown 40%. That seems like a lot, until you compare it to the productivity gains we've seen in manufacturing in the last 20 years. They've gone up 220%. The difference is simply staggering. So, if this divergence has existed for so long and become so large, why won't it simply continue? I mean, it very well could, I admit that. But I suspect it won't. Because as service productivity has grown slowly, the cost of services has risen and risen and risen as compared to incomes and as compared to everything else we buy. What this means is that there is a tremendous incentive for competitive service providing firms to eventually solve this problem through the rising cost of services and solve it with technology. This incentive will eventually yield a productivity breakthrough in services, and I see it as very much a losing bet, a bet that runs against the way that American economic history has evolved throughout the years to expect otherwise. So I just want to quickly run through my 3 predictions again. So the first is that almost all economic interactions will occur across borders, not within them. Socioeconomic inequality will worsen within our country, but among countries, there'll be less. And lastly, the productivity revolution that we've just talked about in goods industries will eventually, sooner or later, in the long run, have to occur in the services industry. Thanks so much for your time. My email address is there, and they mentioned my blog. I mean, you're free to check it out if you're interested. I write it.